How to not lose her by setting boundaries. Warning, this video is for men who are dedicated to learning effective and practical strategies about dating and relationships. It will be a slightly longer video, maybe even 2 or 3 parts. So if you only have an attention span of 10 seconds, then I suggest you keep scrolling. On the other hand, if you want to learn what boundaries are, how to set them effectively, and what terrible things will happen to you as a man if you fail to communicate them, then this is for you. First of all, let's take a look at the definition of personal boundaries according to Wikipedia. Personal boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave towards them and how they will respond when someone passes those limits. They are built out of a mix of conclusions, beliefs, opinions, attitudes, and past experiences and social learning. So why is it so important that you learn to set clear boundaries over the process of dating and relationships? Well, let's take a look at what happens when you're dating a woman and you fail to communicate those boundaries clearly. Let's take the example of texting. She expects you to text a lot over the course of the day or the week, but you're just not the kind of man who enjoys texting. You prefer speaking in real life. First, a behavior occurs that has a negative impact on your emotional, mental, or even physical well-being. In this case, the demand for more texting. Number 2, you experience negative emotions or thoughts. 3, you either tolerate the occurrence of such behavior or demands, or you change your own behavior against your own will to please the demands of the other person. In other words, you start texting more even though you actually don't want to. 4, you'll begin to resent yourself for not standing up for yourself and enduring a little bit of emotional tension and conflict in exchange for long-term harmony and inner peace. 5, she will keep up the behavior or demands, or most likely intensify them and continuously ask more of you. 6, you give up your values and your integrity as a man, and you begin to change yourself at a behavioral as well as habitual level against what part of you knows to be in your best interest. She will lose interest in you as a man because no reasonable woman wants to be in a relationship with a man who doesn't define himself by setting clear boundaries and thereby keeping his value high. 8, the relationship will eventually fail either because you'll begin hating yourself in your current inauthentic form so much that you'll begin to develop destructive habits, or she will just leave you because she just doesn't feel attracted to you anymore because the relationship has been fully depolarized. Now, what happens if you do set clear boundaries? Number 1, a behavior occurs that has a negative impact on your emotional, mental, or physical well-being, just like before. Number 2, you will feel negative emotions or thoughts. So the first 2 steps are obviously the same. Number 3, you set a boundary by first of all mustering the emotional resilience required to step into constructive conflict, and yes, it does require courage and emotional resilience. And secondly, by honestly communicating what you're not willing to do or tolerate, in this case, a lot of texting. 4, instead of hating yourself, you'll feel an up until then dormant sense of strength and groundedness in your own character because you protected yourself against the complete disintegration of your character, which would otherwise have been the inevitable result of not setting boundaries. 5, now, the other person will either accept the boundary, or you'll have a negotiation around it, or the relationship will end right then and there. And that's why it takes courage to set clear boundaries, because with every boundary you communicate, you create another potential breaking point for the relationship. 6, if she accepts the boundary, the attraction she feels for you is immediately amplified because she now grows in her faith that you'll bring forth a similar degree of resilience and determination when it comes to setting boundaries to protect your relationship with her against outside threats that may come in the form of unwanted demands or behaviors. 7, by your inner willingness to walk away from anything that violates or inhibits your authentic expression as a man and only tolerating what's compatible with your values, you have now strengthened the relationship and given it the highest possible chance to succeed. So here are a couple of examples of behaviors and demands that you need to set clear boundaries against. Number 1, a lack of respect for your time. She either shows up too late, or she doesn't respect the fact that you have another meeting after your date with her and she demands that you stay longer. Second, a general demand for your time. She might text you and say, "Hey, I'm free now, let's talk." She doesn't like the fact that you talk so loud. She thinks you shouldn't be spending so much time on your business or coding or playing with your little Star Wars figures. She speaks disrespectfully about your friends or your family. She fundamentally disagrees with your views on politics or religion, and she expects you to change. She doesn't want you to see other girls, even though you've only been dating for a couple of weeks. Things like verbal or even physical abuse seem almost too obvious to be added to the list, but then again, common sense isn't common practice. So how do we communicate boundaries effectively? First of all, you have to remember to use your gut as well as your brain. You have to learn to trust your gut when something feels off, but then also rationally evaluate who's right and who's wrong in this situation. Therefore, it can sometimes be absolutely helpful to gather outside feedback from multiple people. You can absolutely straight away have a face-to-face conversation, but it's also perfectly okay to first send a text message, an email or a voice message. This gives you time to gather your thoughts and to not give in to emotional impulses that can sometimes derail you in a conversation. So now when we get to the actual communication of the boundary, it's very important that we don't blame or attack the other person. Instead, we can use Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication system. Step number 1, describe what happened without blaming the other person. Step number 2, how did you feel, and not how the other person made you feel, because this is, according to Marshall D. Rosenberg, already violent communication. Step number 3, what was your need in the situation that wasn't being met? And step number 4, what is your concrete ask for the future for the other person? In an actual conversation, it could sound something like this. Last week, you asked me twice to be more responsive via text, and to be honest, I didn't really feel comfortable with that because I'm just not the kind of guy who texts a lot and I have a need for my own space. I do like talking to you in person, but texting really isn't my thing. And that's just something that I'm not gonna change, so please respect that. Using these 4 steps from Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication will really help you take the aggression and the blaming out of the communication of your boundaries, and it'll significantly increase the probability that you'll have a successful outcome at the end of it. A few important final notes on the subject of drawing boundaries. Most behaviors or demands that you need to communicate clear boundaries against are not ill-intended. Most of the time, it's not the case that the other person is evil or toxic. Having an unmatched level of expectation of one another is a completely normal part of 2 human beings coming together. That being said, sometimes you have to cut people out for the sake of your own sanity. When you communicate a boundary, never ever threaten the relationship. Never ever give the other person an ultimatum. It's either this or it just won't work. Believe me, once you've said it, you'll never be able to take it back, and it'll linger in the other person's mind for a real long time. If you are harsh in your consequences, you can be soft in your words. What you've learned here today applies to all kinds of relationships, not just to those between men and women. Even though setting boundaries can feel quite uncomfortable at times, and maybe you're even worried about it, it's super important that you step into constructive conflict, because as Jordan Peterson says, conflict delayed is conflict multiplied. And as a final note, please never become nihilistic or resentful towards the process of dating or even relationships in general. Even though subjects like drawing boundaries can feel quite heavy or difficult to digest at times, also remember that the greatest joys you'll ever experience in this lifetime come from relationships to other people, especially women.